The movie starts off with Frank Vega. He successfully captured Panther, the drug lord responsible for his best friend's murder. He's also exposed the mayor's involvement in Panther's crimes. Now Frank decides to keep going with his life and sets up a community boxing center. We then see Frank waking up to start his day. He heads over to a convenience store managed by his friend Bernie Pope, right on the ground floor of the community center building. Frank is full of energy, even at his age, but Bernie has health issues and rarely leaves the house due to agoraphobia. Besides running the boxing gym, Frank is a boxing trainer for teens, both inside and outside the ring. He shares a special bond with Manny Parks, his star pupil who's gearing up for his professional boxing debut. Manny's working hard under Frank's guidance, and Frank is a war veteran. One evening, Frank invites Manny over to his place to watch a video of Manny's upcoming opponent in a professional match. Frank wants Manny to study the match so he can prepare and anticipate his opponent's moves. As they watched the video, Manny suddenly surprised Frank with a gift, a cell phone. Inside, there was a video Manny had made for Frank. In the video, Manny expressed his heartfelt thanks to Frank for being like a second father to him, especially after Manny's own father had passed away. Just then, Manny received a text message on his phone that required him to leave urgently. He bid farewell to Frank and rushed to meet his boss, Adolfo Herrera. However, things took a terrible turn as Adolfo accused Manny of secretly taking his money. Manny tried to explain and deny the accusation, but Adolfo wouldn't listen. He ordered his men to attack Manny. Despite being outnumbered, Manny's boxing skills, honed through his training with Frank, allowed him to put up a good fight. He managed to defeat one of Adolfo's men. However, tragedy struck when, with his guard down, Manny was stabbed from behind and killed instantly. The next day, a police officer named Malark came to see Frank. He brought the sad news of Manny's tragic death the previous night, just before Manny was about to debut as a professional boxer. Frank felt deeply saddened by this. He attended Manny's funeral at his house to offer condolences to Manny's mother, Rosaria. Frank also tried to comfort Manny's younger sister, Julia, promising to make a secret door in her closet. As Frank was about to leave, Rosaria asked him to help find Manny's killer. Frank didn't give a definite answer. Instead, he advised her to wait for the results of the police investigation into Manny's murder. That evening, Frank headed to the convenience store, but ended up having an argument with Bernie. Bernie thought Frank was too involved in his personal life, even though Frank was only looking out for him, urging him to go to the hospital and get his health checked. Around the same time, a gang of armed men entered the shop with intentions to rob Bernie. Thankfully, Frank managed to fight them off and urged Bernie to call the police. Soon after, the police arrived and took the armed men into custody. Frank then talked to Malark about Manny's murder case, which was still under investigation. Malark shared that they found narcotics in Manny's belongings, suggesting his involvement in drug dealing. Hearing this, Frank was determined to keep his boxing center drug-free. He warned his students sternly about the severe consequences of using or selling drugs. Frank also tried to question Manny's friend, Tucson, about his connection to the drug dealers. However, Tucson claimed to have no knowledge of it. Despite this, Frank remained suspicious and decided to secretly follow Tucson. That night, Frank followed Tucson to an apartment complex, where Tucson planned to pick up narcotic pills for selling. Frank confronted Tucson, and Tucson, caught off guard, couldn't avoid Frank's questions. Tucson revealed that Manny had been selling the drugs for a few months to support his family, but had intended to quit after his professional debut match. Frank was upset because he had no clue about Manny and Tucson's involvement in drug dealing. Worried about Tucson's future, Frank ordered him to take him to the place where the drugs were made. There, Frank confronted Adolfo's men and destroyed all the narcotics. Adolfo, getting wind of Frank's attack on their drug operation, informed his father, Leandro Herrera, an Argentinian diplomat and local cartel leader. Leandro was furious and ordered Adolfo to find and eliminate the person responsible for damaging their drug business. Meanwhile, Frank, still grieving for Manny, watched a video Manny had recorded on his cell phone while drinking. Frank couldn't hold back his tears. He loved Manny like a son and found it hard to move on. Wanting to drown his sorrows, Frank headed to Bernie's shop to buy more beer, but the shop was closed. Frank attempted to wake up Bernie, but Bernie didn't respond. Frustrated, Frank decided to go elsewhere to buy beer. However, he was unexpectedly confronted by Adolfo's men, who insulted Manny. This infuriated Frank, and he began to fight them. But because he was still under the influence of alcohol, Frank quickly found himself overpowered. Luckily, Bernie, upon hearing the commotion, mustered the courage to come out of his house and joined the fray, using a hockey stick to help Frank. Together, they managed to defeat Adolfo's men. Afterward, Frank interrogated one of Adolfo's men, hoping to get information about Manny's murder. However, the man only revealed that Manny had met Adolfo before his death. Bernie tended to Frank's injuries and then opened up about his own past. He shared that he was once a talented hockey player in the minor leagues, dreaming of becoming the first African American to play in the National Hockey League. Unfortunately, an injury forced him to retire early. Later on, he was diagnosed with a rare liver disease and couldn't get on a donor list due to his age. Doctors gave him only about 6 months to live. Learning of Frank's intention to seek revenge for Manny's death, Bernie expressed his desire to help with the time he had left. Frank agreed, and the two decided to find Adolfo together. The next day, Frank and Bernie got ready to start their investigation and locate Adolfo. They planned to use Bernie's old car, but it turned out the car was too old and broken down from neglect over the years, so they had to take the city bus to reach the drug dealer's apartment. When they arrived at the apartment, they discovered that Adolfo and his crew had cleaned up everything to erase any evidence. Frank decided to seek help from a female police officer named Carmen to examine Manny's belongings, which were held by the police as evidence of a crime. Carmen was hesitant at first, fearing for her job, but Frank managed to persuade her to assist him. Frank then went through Manny's contact list and found information about his drug supplier, Hammer. With this lead in hand, Frank and Bernie hurried to find Hammer. However, Hammer refused to cooperate or share any information about Adolfo. Frustrated, Frank resorted to torture, while Bernie attempted to get information by charming Hammer's girlfriend, who seemed interested in him. The next day, Adolfo learned that Frank had survived their earlier encounter and didn't hesitate to torture Hammer and dismantle his drug operation to extract information about Adolfo's whereabouts. On another note, Frank went over to Manny's house to fulfill his promise to Julia by making a secret door for her to use as a hiding spot in her room. Julia was thrilled with the idea of having her very own secret hiding place. Shortly after, Frank ran into Bernie, who had asked Tucson to fix his old car. Since there were many repairs needed, Frank and Bernie decided to let Tucson continue his work while they headed home. However, as they were almost home, a massive explosion occurred that destroyed their house. Thankfully, both Frank and Bernie survived the explosion. Mullark warned them to stop their fight against Adolfo and his crew because they were extremely dangerous. Rosaria, who heard about the explosion, kindly offered them refuge in her house and allowed them to stay in Manny's room for a while. The following day, Frank and Bernie went to Adolfo's residence in Malibu. Frank used a clever trick to bypass a security officer guarding the place. However, once he managed to sneak inside, Adolfo quickly discovered him, and they got into a physical brawl until Frank had Adolfo cornered. Unexpectedly, a security officer arrived and pointed his gun at Frank when he realized Frank was one of the badasses. Meanwhile, Adolfo seized the moment and launched a counterattack, managing to bring down Frank. Luckily, Bernie arrived just in time to assist Frank. Together, they pressured Adolfo for the truth about Manny's death. At first, Adolfo was hesitant to reveal anything, but he eventually confessed that Leandro was the mastermind behind Manny's murder. Upon learning this, Frank demanded Adolfo to set up a meeting with his father, as they were determined to seek revenge for Manny's death. The next day, Frank and Bernie met Leandro at a restaurant, and shortly after, he was arrested and sent to prison for his crimes. Frank returned to Rosaria's house and shared the news of the mastermind's arrest with her. Rosaria was overwhelmed with relief and gratitude, hugging Frank tightly. That evening, Frank and Rosaria had a heartfelt conversation, and their romantic relationship grew stronger. However, their joy was short-lived when Malark delivered the disappointing news that Leandro had diplomatic immunity and couldn't be arrested without solid evidence of his crimes. Realizing they needed concrete evidence to put Leandro behind bars, Frank and Bernie decided to tail him in a taxi. They followed him to a meatpacking plant that Leandro was using as a front for his drug operations. Instructing the taxi driver to wait, Frank and Bernie infiltrated the plant by posing as employees. Inside the factory, they uncovered Leandro's scheme of smuggling drugs within packages of fresh meat destined for distribution across the city. As Frank reached for a package of the tainted meat to use as evidence, they were unfortunately discovered by Leandro's henchmen. The two were bound and confined to a cold storage room, where Leandro took the opportunity to boast about his legal immunity. In a chilling twist, Leandro also revealed his knowledge of Frank's romantic involvement with Rosaria, hinting at sinister intentions toward her. Leandro ordered his henchmen to leave Frank and Bernie to freeze in the cold room while they abducted Rosaria. Fearing for Rosaria and Julia's safety, Frank attempted to free himself using the charm bracelet Julia had given him. Meanwhile, Leandro's men successfully kidnapped Rosaria, but they couldn't locate Julia, who was hiding behind a secret door. After breaking free and defeating Leandro's guards at the factory, Frank and Bernie rushed to Rosaria's house, where Julia informed them of her mother's kidnapping. Long story short, they managed to track down Rosaria's location, but faced a dilemma when they realized they couldn't afford a taxi. This led to a heated argument between Frank and Bernie. Luckily, Tucson arrived with Bernie's repaired truck just in time. While the badasses headed out to rescue Rosaria, Adolfo, who had abducted her, received word that Frank and Bernie had escaped from the factory and were closing in on their location. Upon receiving the news, Adolfo ordered his men to shoot Frank and Bernie from the air using a helicopter. Luckily, Bernie managed to dodge the attack by taking a route through the wilderness, while Frank used a grenade to bring down the helicopter. They caught up with Adolfo and immobilized him. However, it turned out that Rosaria had been transferred to Leandro's car. Frank called Leandro and pressured him into a trade for Rosaria. Realizing that his son was a hostage, Leandro agreed to the exchange. Frank set the location for their meeting. When they reached the meeting point, Leandro released Rosaria, and Frank released Adolfo. Just as Rosaria was about to approach Frank, she tried to warn him that Leandro had a hidden gunman in his vehicle. Fortunately, Bernie shot the gunman just in time with his old gun from the truck's glove compartment, which he had believed was unusable. Shortly after that, the rest of Leandro's men showed up, and he boldly challenged Frank to a fistfight, even bringing up Manny. At first, Leandro had the upper hand, but Frank's anger fueled him to fight back fiercely until Leandro was knocked out cold. Finally, the police arrived to arrest Adolfo and his gang, discovering that Leandro had died. In the days that followed, everyone celebrated their victory over the Herreras. Frank and Rosaria continued their romantic involvement, and Bernie was recovering well after receiving a successful liver transplant from the deceased Leandro. Bernie also ended up with Hammer's girlfriend, whom he had flirted with earlier. The movie's moral lesson reminds us that growing old doesn't mean we're useless. Age is just a number, so keep a youthful spirit even as you get older.